When I purchased my dream home in the historic Oakridge district, I imagined peaceful evenings restoring its beautiful Victorian architecture and tending to my prized rose garden. What I didn't imagine was Victoria Blackwood, the self-proclaimed guardian of Pine Valley Estates HOA, trying to literally steal my property through a series of increasingly absurd legal maneuvers that would eventually cost her organization over $100,000 in damages. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After 15 years of apartment living in downtown Seattle, where my neighbor's idea of personal space was a paper-thin wall and my landlord's solution to black mold was a fresh coat of paint, I'd finally saved enough for my dream home. It wasn't just any house. It was a gorgeous 1890s Victorian, sitting proudly on a quarter-acre lot, complete with ornate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that practically begged for a rocking chair and a glass of lemonade. The location was perfect, just outside the trendy Pine Valley development where cookie-cutter McMansions competed for the title of Most Beige House. My property sat on the other side of Willow Creek, technically part of the historic Oakridge district, which was exactly what I wanted. No HOA restrictions, no architectural committees, just me and my freedom to restore this beautiful old home to its former glory. The price was a steal too, probably because the house needed what real estate agents politely call TLC. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Harrison, had lived there for 40 years before moving to assisted living. His children were eager to sell, and after a thorough inspection, confirmed the house was structurally sound, despite its cosmetic issues. I jumped at the opportunity. My first month was pure bliss. I spent weekends stripping decades of wallpaper, discovering gorgeous hardwood underneath tired carpeting, and planning my renovation schedule. My neighbors on both sides, actual neighbors, not HOA members, were lovely people who brought me welcome baskets and shared stories about the neighborhood's history. Mrs. Chen from next door even gave me cuttings from her heritage roses to start my garden. Then came that fateful Sunday morning in May. I was on my porch, coffee in hand, admiring the sunrise and mentally planning my day of restoration work. That's when I spotted her, Victoria Blackwood, striding up my newly gravelled driveway like she was leading a corporate takeover. Her crisp white pantsuit practically glowed in the morning light, and the tablet she clutched looked more like a weapon than a device. I'd heard whispers about Victoria from Mrs. Chen, how she'd transformed the once casual Pine Valley community into what locals called the regime, how she'd instituted rules about everything from mailbox heights to the acceptable shades of white paint, how she'd even tried to ban garden gnomes because they degraded property values with their perpetual smirking. But Pine Valley was across the creek. I wasn't in her jurisdiction. I wasn't in any HOA's jurisdiction. I had the property records to prove it. "Good morning," I called out, trying to be neighborly, despite the sense of impending doom climbing my porch steps. "Can I help?" "You!" Victoria's red lips curved into what I suppose she thought was a smile, but looked more like a shark sizing up its prey. "Actually," she said, her manicured fingers tapping her tablet screen, "I'm here to help you. We've noticed some serious concerns about your property's compliance with Pine Valley standards." I blinked, took another sip of coffee, and reminded myself to stay calm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This property isn't part of Pine Valley. I'm in Oakridge." That's when she said the words that would launch a 6-month legal battle, drain my renovation budget, and ultimately lead to one of the most satisfying moments of justice I've ever witnessed. Oh, honey, you really should have read the fine print. According to our new district expansion plan, your property falls well within our jurisdiction. and we have quite a few concerns about its current state. Little did Victoria know, she'd just picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. You see, before I'd spent 15 years renting apartments, I'd spent 3 years working as a paralegal, specializing in property law, and I was about to teach her exactly why you don't mess with someone's property rights. But that was just the beginning of a battle that would involve forged documents, midnight photography sessions, and an HOA board meeting that would go down in local history as the night of the Great Gnome Rebellion. Little did I know that my peaceful dream of restoring a historic Victorian would spiral into a twisted game of property rights and power plays. The day after Victoria's ominous visit, I discovered just how far she was willing to go to expand her HOA empire. I was carefully removing old trim from my dining room windows when I heard the distinctive sound of a camera shutter clicking outside. Peering through the dusty glass, I spotted 2 people methodically photographing every angle of my house. One was holding what looked like a measuring tape against my rose bushes, while the other documented each peeling patch of paint like they were collecting evidence at a crime scene. The whole scene might have been comical if it hadn't been so unsettling. I watched as they made their way around my property, checking off items on a clipboard with the same grim determination of health inspectors at a questionable restaurant. When they reached my newly installed vintage-style fence, a perfect match for the house's historical character, they spent a good 15 minutes taking close-up shots and engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. I'd had enough. Throwing on my paint-stained jacket, I marched outside, making sure to let the screen door slam behind me for dramatic effect. "Can I help you folks with something?" The 2 jumped like kids caught stealing cookies. The woman with the camera, wearing a Pine Valley Estates polo shirt that looked fresh off the rack, recovered first. "We're conducting an official property assessment for the HOA," she announced, trying to sound authoritative despite her obvious discomfort. "Official property assessment," I echoed, keeping my voice level despite the growing knot in my stomach. "For a property that isn't part of your HOA?" The man with the measuring tape stepped forward. "Actually, according to the new boundary adjustment proposal," I cut in. "A proposal isn't law, and even if it was, you can't retroactively force an existing property into an HOA without owner consent. You're trespassing." They exchanged glances. The woman's hand tightened on her camera. "Mrs. Blackwood assured us." "Mrs. Blackwood doesn't have the authority to give you permission to be on my property," I stated firmly. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." They scurried off like startled rabbits, but not before the woman called over her shoulder, "You'll be hearing from the board." It would have sounded more threatening if she hadn't nearly tripped over her own feet in her haste to leave. Once they were gone, I sat on my porch steps, mind racing. This wasn't just about an overzealous HOA president anymore. This was a calculated attempt to seize control of my property. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything I could remember about the encounter, including descriptions of the 2 inspectors and approximately how long they'd been photographing my property. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. As I strolled past the pristine lawns and identical mailboxes of Pine Valley Estates, I began to notice something interesting. Posted on several community bulletin boards were notices about an upcoming vote on community expansion. The dates on the notices were fresh, posted just days after I'd closed on my house. Near the community clubhouse, I overheard 2 residents discussing property values and problem areas at the neighborhood's edges. One mentioned something about aggressive acquisition strategies and maintaining community standards. My house wasn't the only target. Victoria was planning a full-scale annexation of the properties bordering Pine Valley. When I returned home, there was an official-looking envelope stuck in my door. Inside was a notice of an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for the following week. The agenda included items like boundary adjustment vote and integration of historic properties. At the bottom, highlighted in yellow, was a note stating that all affected property owners are required to attend. Required? They had another thing coming if they thought they could require me to do anything. But as I read through the document again, something caught my eye. A small reference to a decades-old easement agreement. Was this what Victoria thought gave her the right to claim my property? If so, she was about to learn that one semester of property law didn't make her an expert in real estate legislation. I spent the rest of the evening digging through my closing documents, looking for any mention of easements or HOA agreements. There was nothing, just as I'd thought when I bought the place, but Victoria's confidence suggested she had something up her sleeve, some angle she thought would give her leverage. Whatever she was planning, one thing was becoming crystal clear. This wasn't just about my house anymore. This was about stopping a systematic attempt to strong-arm independent homeowners into an HOA they never agreed to join. And if Victoria wanted a fight, she was about to get one she'd never forget. As I finally went to bed that night, my mind was already formulating a plan. I had exactly 1 week until that board meeting, and I intended to use every minute of it. To prepare for war. Victoria might have her army of clipboard-wielding minions, but I had something better. The law on my side, and a stubborn streak a mile wide. I'll admit, I wasn't always this combative when it came to property rights. But my journey to homeownership had been a long and winding road, filled with enough rental horror stories to fill a book. 10 years of dealing with negligent landlords and steadily rising rents in Seattle had taught me the value of standing your ground. My last apartment had been the final straw. Picture this, a luxury high-rise where the elevator broke down more often than it worked, forcing residents to climb 12 flights of stairs. The property management company's solution? A strongly worded email asking us to be patient while they explored options. 3 months later, we were still exploring those stairs, and my rent had just gone up another 15%. That's when I started seriously looking for a house. Not just any house, something with character, history, and most importantly, something. That was mine. I spent weekends driving through different neighborhoods, researching property values, and learning everything I could about home ownership. I even took evening classes on home maintenance and historic preservation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The search wasn't easy. Seattle's real estate market was brutal, with bidding wars driving prices way above asking. I watched dream house after dream house slip through my fingers, usually snapped up by cash buyers or developers, planning to tear down the existing structures and build modern monstrosities. Then, one rainy Tuesday morning, my realtor called about a property that hadn't even hit the market yet. "It needs work," she warned, "but it's exactly what you've been looking for." She wasn't wrong. The moment I saw the old Victorian, with its weathered gingerbread trim and slightly sagging porch, I knew it was meant to be mine. The previous owner, Mr. Harrison, had lived there since the 1970s. His children told me stories about growing up in the house, about summer evenings spent on that wraparound porch, and winters by the original marble fireplace they were selling because their father needed full-time care, but they wanted the house to go to someone who would love it as much as they had. I spent hours going through the property records before making my offer. The house had been built in 1892 by one of the area's founding families. It had survived 2 major earthquakes, countless storms, and nearly a century and a half of Pacific Northwest weather. The property line had remained unchanged since 1900, when the original owner had sold off a portion of the land that would later become part of Pine Valley. That's what made Victoria's claim so absurd. The boundary between my property and Pine Valley Estates hadn't moved in over 120 years. The creek that separated us had been used as a natural boundary marker since before the HOA even existed. I had maps, surveys, and property records to prove it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized why Victoria might be targeting my house specifically. The old Victorian sat on slightly elevated ground, offering one of the best views in the area. The lot was larger than most in Pine Valley, and the house itself, once restored, would be a showpiece. From a purely strategic standpoint, it was prime real estate. There was also the matter of precedent. If Victoria could successfully force my property into her HOA, what would stop her from doing the same to others? The historic Oakridge district was full of beautiful old homes on generous lots. Compared to the tightly packed McMansions of Pine Valley, we were practically living on estates. I spent that evening going through every document from my home purchase with a fine-toothed comb: purchase agreement, title search, property survey. Everything was in order. The only mention of Pine Valley was in relation to the shared access road that ran along the creek, and that agreement clearly stated it was for access only, not governance. As I sat surrounded by paperwork, I couldn't help but think about Mr. Harrison. He'd tended this property for 4 decades, planting the massive oak trees that now shaded the yard, maintaining the original features of the house even as the neighborhood around him transformed. He'd watched Pine Valley spring up across the creek, seen it change from a casual community into something more restrictive. I owed it to him, and to myself, to fight this. Victoria wasn't just threatening my property rights. She was threatening the character and independence of a historic neighborhood. If she succeeded, how long before other HOAs started trying the same tactics? How many other homeowners would find themselves suddenly subject to rules they never agreed to? Looking out my window at the growing dusk, I could see lights coming on in the Pine Valley houses across the creek. Their uniform appearance, regulated down to the exact shade of exterior lighting, stood in stark contrast to the eclectic charm of my side of the water. That contrast, I realized, was exactly what Victoria couldn't stand, and exactly what I needed to protect. My first 3 weeks in the Victorian were everything I dreamed of and more. Each day brought new discoveries as I peeled back layers of the home's history. Behind a loose piece of baseboard, I found a collection of vintage marbles, probably lost by one of the Harrison children decades ago. In the attic, tucked beneath old insulation, was a newspaper from 1923 announcing the completion of the neighborhood's first paved road. Every morning, I'd wake up early to work on the house before heading to my remote job as a technical writer. The routine was perfect. Coffee on the porch watching the sunrise, a few hours of restoration work, then settling into my makeshift office in what would eventually be the library. The peace and quiet were exactly what I needed to focus, a welcome change from the constant construction noise at my old apartment. Mrs. Chen next door turned out to be a wealth of information about both gardening and local history. She'd lived in her Victorian for 30 years and had photographs of the neighborhood from before Pine Valley existed. "This used to all be orchards," she told me one evening, showing me sepia-toned pictures of apple trees where cookie-cutter houses now stood. The developers came in the 90s, bought up the farmland across the creek. That's when everything started changing. On weekends, I'd work on bigger projects. The previous owners had covered most of the original hardwood floors with carpet, a common practice in the 70s, and removing it was like unwrapping a present. Despite some water staining near the windows, the oak planks underneath were in remarkably good condition. A local restoration expert I'd hired said they could be saved with some careful refinishing. The garden was another joy. Spring was in full swing, and the heritage roses Mrs. Chen had given me were already showing signs of new growth. I discovered an old brick path beneath years of overgrown grass, leading to what had once been a kitchen garden. Clearing it became my Sunday morning ritual, gradually revealing the original layout of the space. Even the neighborhood kids seemed fascinated by the old house. A group of them would often stop their bikes to watch me work, asking questions about what I'd found that day. One afternoon, I showed them the marbles I'd discovered, and their eyes lit up with excitement. "This place is like a treasure hunt," one boy exclaimed. I had to agree. The contrast between my side of the creek and Pine Valley couldn't have been more striking. While I was carefully stripping paint and uncovering original details, they were holding meetings about standardizing front door colors. While Mrs. Chen and I were exchanging heritage plant cuttings, they were distributing guidelines about acceptable garden ornaments. But the peace couldn't last forever. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs earlier. The increased car traffic. On our usually quiet street, always the same vehicles driving slowly past my house. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by the Pine Valley clubhouse during my evening walks. The way certain HOA board members would stare at my property with calculating expressions. I was too absorbed in my restoration projects to pay much attention. The house had so many wonderful surprises, like the stained glass window I found boarded up in the dining room, or the original cast-iron claw-foot tub hidden beneath layers of cheap refinishing in the upstairs bathroom. Each discovery felt like the house was revealing its secrets to me, trusting me to restore it properly. That last weekend before Victoria's appearance was particularly productive. I'd finally finished stripping the wallpaper in the front parlor, revealing original plaster walls with subtle decorative molding. The local historical society had even expressed interest in documenting my restoration process, suggesting the house might qualify for historic preservation status once the work was complete. Sunday evening, I stood in my yard admiring the progress, mentally planning the next week's projects. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the old house, highlighting the intricate details of the Victorian architecture. Even in its partially restored state, it was beautiful. Mrs. Chen came over to share some fresh-baked cookies and admire the work I'd done on the garden path. "You're doing a wonderful job," she said, looking up at the house. "It's nice to see someone who appreciates these old places." Then she hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "Just be careful. Some people around here don't like things they can't control." I nodded, thinking she was referring to the general tension between the historic district and Pine Valley. I had no idea just how prophetic her warning would prove to be, or that in less than 24 hours my peaceful renovation project would turn into a battle for property rights that would rock the entire community. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of spring peepers chirping in the creek, blissfully unaware that it would be my last truly peaceful evening in my new home for quite some time. The morning Victoria Blackwood appeared on my doorstep wasn't just the end of my peace. It was the beginning of a calculated assault on my property rights that would make my head spin. Like a predator who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, she arrived precisely when she thought I'd be most vulnerable. I was in the middle of what I'd started calling Operation Paint Removal, carefully stripping decades of questionable color choices from my front door to reveal the original mahogany underneath. The local historical society had confirmed it was the house's original door from 1892, making it both a priceless artifact and a huge restoration headache. My arms were sore, my hair was tied up in a messy bun, and I had specks of paint stripper on my oldest work clothes. That's when I heard it. The distinct click-clack of expensive heels on my gravel driveway, moving with the determined rhythm of someone who expected the world to part before them. Looking up, I saw Victoria approaching, tablet in hand, wearing what appeared to be a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Behind her, two men in Pine Valley Estates polo shirts carried what looked suspiciously like surveying equipment. "Good morning," she called out with artificial brightness that wouldn't have fooled a toddler. "I trust you received our notice about the property assessment." I straightened up, deliberately wiping my hands on my paint-stained jeans. "I received your trespassing photographers, if that's what you mean." Her smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. Those were official HOA inspectors conducting a preliminary evaluation. Today, we're here to do a formal survey of the property. We'll need access to your backyard. I stepped between her and my front steps. No, you won't. This property isn't part of Pine Valley Estates, and you have no authority to conduct any kind of survey here. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand reached into a leather portfolio. Actually, I have something you might find interesting. She pulled out what looked like an old document, protected in a clear sleeve. This is a copy of the original 1990 Development Agreement for Pine Valley Estates. If you look at Section 12, Paragraph 3, I took the document, careful to keep my paint-stained hands away from the sleeve. The paper looked aged, but something about it felt off. My years as a paralegal had taught me to spot inconsistencies in legal documents, and this one was setting off all kinds of alarm bells. This clause, Victoria continued, pointing to a highlighted section, clearly states that all properties bordering the original development fall under HOA jurisdiction for the purposes of maintaining community standards and property values. I skimmed the paragraph, my suspicion growing with each word. The language was too convenient, too specific to her current land grab. Interesting, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Mind if I take a photo of this for my records? Of course not, she replied, looking pleased. We believe in full transparency. I pulled out my phone and took several clear photos, making sure to capture the document's letterhead and date stamp. Great. Now please leave my property. Any further attempts to enter without permission will be considered trespassing. Victoria's smile finally cracked just slightly. You're making a mistake. The board has already voted to proceed with the integration of border properties. Fighting this will only cost you money. Threatening me isn't the smart play here, Victoria, I replied, handing back the document. And if you or any of your people set foot on my property again without written permission, I'll call the police. The surveyors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria's perfect posture stiffened even further, if that was possible. We'll be in touch, she said, turning on her heel. The surveyors quickly followed, looking relieved to be leaving. As soon as they were gone, I rushed inside and fired up my laptop. Something about that document had felt wrong, and I was going to figure out what. The letterhead had used Pine Valley's current logo, but a quick search revealed they'd rebranded in 2005. The original 1990 documents shouldn't have had that logo. More importantly, the paper itself looked artificially aged. I'd seen enough. Genuine documents from the 90s to know the difference between natural yellowing and the kind you get from tea staining or other artificial aging techniques. I picked up my phone and called the county records office. If Victoria wanted to play games with forged documents, she was about to learn she'd picked the wrong person to trick. I might spend my days as a technical writer, but I hadn't forgotten my paralegal training or my contacts in the legal community. As I waited on hold, I watched through my window as Victoria's group made their way back to Pine Valley. They stopped at the edge of my property, gesturing at something and making notes. Whatever they were planning, it was clear this visit had just been the opening move in what promised to be a complex game of property rights chess. Well, if that's how they wanted to play it, I was ready. I had truth, documentation, and the law. On my side, Victoria had just made her first major mistake, and I intended to make her regret it. The first real confrontation came 3 days after Victoria's visit with her suspicious document. I was up early, coffee in hand, monitoring the crew I'd hired to repair some rotting wood on my porch columns, a necessary repair that would preserve the original Victorian woodwork. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of machinery starting up across my property line. At first, I thought it was just routine landscaping from the Pine Valley side. But as I walked around the corner of my house, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, right at the edge of my property, was a construction crew setting up equipment. A large sign had been posted overnight: future site of Pine Valley Estates security gate, private property. The proposed gate location would cut directly across my legal easement, the only access road to my property. They were trying to literally fence me in. I marched straight over to the construction foreman, property documents in hand. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite my rising anger. "You need to stop work immediately. This is a private easement, and you don't have authorization to build here." The foreman, a burly man with a well-worn hard hat, looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we have all the required permits from Pine Valley Estates. They own this access road." "No, they don't," I replied firmly, pulling out my property survey. "This is a deeded easement that comes with my property. Here's the documentation. If you continue construction, you'll be interfering with my legal right of access." He studied the papers, frowning. "Look, I just go where they tell me. You'll need to take this up with the HOA." "I'm taking it up with you right now," I stated, pulling out my phone. "I'm calling my lawyer, and then I'm calling the police to report unauthorized construction. Your choice, if you want to be here when they arrive." That got his attention. Construction crews know that legal disputes can mean delayed payments and complications with their insurance. He held up his hands in surrender. "Let me make some calls." Within 15 minutes, Victoria herself appeared, power-walking down the street in yet another impeccable suit. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, as if she hadn't deliberately orchestrated this entire situation. "You know exactly what the problem is," I replied, holding up my easement documentation. "This attempted gate construction violates my legal right of access. Either stop it now, or I'll file for an emergency injunction." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "The board has approved this security measure. As per the document I showed you earlier, we have full authority to make improvements to community access points." "You mean the forged document with the wrong letterhead?" I watched with satisfaction as her perfect composure slipped for just a moment. "I've already submitted it to a forensic document examiner. Would you like to guess what they're going to find?" The construction crew was now openly watching our confrontation. Victoria glanced at them, then back at me. "This is a simple community improvement project. Fighting it will only harm your property values. This is a blatant attempt to restrict my legal access to my property," I corrected her. "And if that equipment isn't gone in the next hour, I'll be filing police reports for both the construction attempt and the forged documentation." Victoria pulled out her phone and stepped away to make a call. 5 minutes later, she turned to the construction crew. "Pack up. We'll reschedule this project." As the crew began dismantling their equipment, Victoria approached me one last time. "This isn't over. The board meeting is tomorrow night. I suggest you attend if you want to have any say in future developments." "Oh, I'll be there," I assured her, "and I won't be coming alone." After she left, Mrs. Chen emerged from her porch, where she'd been watching the whole scene. "I got it all on video," she said, holding up her phone. "My grandson showed me how to record in HD. That woman has been trying to cut off access to our street for years." I could have hugged her. "Would you be willing to share that video with my lawyer?" "Honey," she smiled, "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to that HOA for a long time. I'll give you whatever you need." That evening, as I prepared my documentation for the board meeting, I realized Victoria's attempted gate construction had given me something valuable: proof of their intentions. They weren't just trying to claim jurisdiction over my property. They were actively trying to force me to submit to their authority by controlling my access. Well, they were about to learn that cutting off someone's legal access to their property was not only unethical, but also very, very illegal. Tomorrow's board meeting was going to be interesting, to say the least. I spent the rest of the evening making calls, gathering supporters, and preparing for what promised to be an unforgettable showdown. Little did I know, Victoria had one more surprise planned before the meeting. one that would push this conflict from a simple property dispute into full-scale legal warfare. That evening, as I reviewed my documents one last time before the board meeting, the true scope of what we were fighting over came into crystal clear focus. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about establishing a dangerous precedent that could affect homeowners everywhere. If Pine Valley succeeded in forcing my property into their HOA without consent, what would stop other associations from doing the same? I spread everything out on my dining room table: the original property deed from 1892, my current deed, the easement documentation, surveys from 3 different decades, and historical maps of the area. Each document told the same story. My property was definitively outside Pine Valley's boundaries and had been since before the HOA even existed. Then there was Victoria's suspiciously convenient original agreement with its clearly forged letterhead. I'd spent the afternoon digitally comparing it to genuine Pine Valley documents from the 90s that I'd obtained from the county records office. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. Wrong font, wrong paper stock, and most damning of all wrong signature from the original development company's president. A knock at my door interrupted my document review. It was Mrs. Chen, clutching a thick manila envelope. "I found something you need to see," she said, spreading out yellowed newspaper clippings on my table. "These are from when Pine Valley was first developed. The articles detailed the original development plans, including specific mentions of the creek as a natural boundary. One piece, dated 1991, explicitly stated that properties east of the creek, including what would become my house, were excluded from the development due to their historic status. They tried this before," Mrs. Chen explained, pointing to a smaller article from 1995. The original HOA board attempted to claim authority over the historic districts. They lost in court, decisively. This was gold. "Do you mind if I scan these?" "Take them," she said. "I've kept them all these years, knowing someday they'd be needed again. Victoria isn't the first person to try expanding Pine Valley's reach, just the most aggressive." As we talked, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Victoria's attempted gate construction wasn't just about controlling access. It was about creating leverage. By controlling the only road to my property, they could effectively force me to join their HOA or risk being cut off from my own home. The core conflict was now clear. This was a calculated attempt to use infrastructure control as a weapon against independent homeowners. Victoria and her board weren't just overstepping their authority, they were trying to establish a new method of forcing property acquisition through access control and legal intimidation. I called my lawyer to update her on the newspaper findings. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "It establishes a clear pattern and precedent. They tried this before and lost. A judge will be very interested in why they're attempting it again with forged documents." "What's our strategy for the board meeting tomorrow?" I asked. "Let them talk," she advised. "The more they say about their plans on record, the better. Just remember, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and most importantly, don't lose your temper. That's what they want." After hanging up, I made one more call to a friend who worked for the local newspaper. If Pine Valley wanted to play games with property rights, it was time to shine some very public light on their tactics. Looking out my window at the creek that marked the boundary between my property and Pine Valley, I thought about all the homeowners who'd faced similar battles without the resources or knowledge to fight back. How many had given in to HOA demands simply because they couldn't afford to resist? The stakes were bigger than just my property now. This was about standing up to a system that thought it could bully and intimidate its way into controlling independent homeowners. If Victoria and her board succeeded with me, they'd try it with others. The historic district would disappear house by house, replaced by their cookie-cutter vision of community standards. Well, they'd picked the wrong house, and The wrong homeowner to test their expansion strategy on. Tomorrow's board meeting wouldn't just be about defending my property rights. It would be about exposing their entire scheme and making sure it couldn't be repeated. As I gathered my documents for the meeting, I spotted the original brass doorknob I'd been restoring. It had been tarnished almost black when I bought the house, but hours of careful cleaning had revealed beautiful engraving underneath. Like that doorknob, the truth about Pine Valley's tactics just needed a little light and effort to become clear. To everyone. The next morning, right before the board meeting, Pine Valley's official violation notice arrived by certified mail. Opening that envelope was like unwrapping a gift of pure audacity. They'd managed to compile a list of alleged violations so extensive it made War and Peace look like a quick read. According to their meticulously detailed document, my historic Victorian home was in violation of no less than 37 different HOA regulations. The accusations ranged from the ridiculous to the outright absurd, non-compliant architectural features, apparently my authentic Victorian gingerbread. Trim didn't meet their standards for community aesthetic cohesion, unauthorized landscaping modifications, my crime. The heritage rose garden I'd planted with Mrs. Chen's cuttings wasn't on their approved plant list. Improper paint color selection, never mind that I hadn't even painted the house yet. They were preemptively objecting to any color that might not match their beige and taupe palette. Unapproved structural elements. They'd listed my original 1892 wraparound porch as a non-conforming addition that needed to be modified or removed. Insufficient lawn maintenance. Rich, considering I'd been meticulously restoring the original Victorian garden layout. Non-standard mailbox height. My historic brass mailbox, apparently, was 2 inches too high according to their regulations. Visible renovation materials, because heaven forbid anyone see evidence that I was actively restoring a historic home. The list went on and on, each violation more preposterous than the last. They'd even included a section about my non-conforming architectural embellishments, literally criticizing the original Victorian design elements that made my house historically significant. But the real kicker came at the bottom of the notice. They'd helpfully included a calculation of fines, $150 per violation per day, retroactive to the date of their first inspection. The total they were demanding, $27,150 and counting. They'd also attached a compliance agreement that would waive all fines if I simply signed my property over to HOA jurisdiction and agreed to their Renovation Oversight Committee's recommendations. These recommendations, detailed in an attached document, would essentially strip my historic home of everything that made it unique. I called my lawyer immediately. "You need to see this," I said, scanning and emailing her the documents. "They're trying to use fake violations to force compliance." Her response was immediate. "This is perfect. They've just handed us written proof of their harassment. Bring the original documents to the meeting tonight. Don't let them out of your sight." I spent the next hour photographing every inch of my property, documenting its current condition. If they wanted to play the violation game, I'd be ready. With evidence of my own. Mrs. Chen helped, taking pictures from her property that showed my ongoing restoration work. While we were documenting, 3 more Pine Valley residents stopped by. They'd received similar violation notices, though none as extensive as mine. All had properties bordering the HOA's current boundaries. "They're trying to scare us," said Mr. Rodriguez, who owned a beautiful craftsman house down the street. "Last week, they claimed my garden gnomes were hostile decorative elements. They told me my bird feeder was attracting non-approved wildlife," added Mrs. Patterson, an elderly resident who'd lived in her home for 40 years. Each notice followed. The same pattern: outrageous violations, excessive fines, and a generous offer to waive everything if the homeowner just submitted to HOA authority. It was like watching a protection racket operate under the guise of community standards. I invited everyone inside and started making copies of all our violation notices. If Victoria thought she could isolate and intimidate us individually, she was about to learn the power of unified resistance. By the time I finished organizing all the documentation, I had a clear picture of their strategy. They were using these violation notices as leverage, hoping the threat of massive fines would force compliance. It was clever in a devious sort of way, but it was also legally dubious and ethically bankrupt. Looking at my historic home with its intricate woodwork and character-filled details, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just attacking my property rights, they were threatening to erase a piece of architectural history. Every violation they'd cited was actually a feature that made this house special, that told the story of our neighborhood's past. The board meeting was in 2 hours. I had my documentation, my photographs, and most importantly, proof that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a systematic attempt to expand their control through intimidation. Victoria wanted to play hardball with violation notices? Fine. I'd show her exactly what real violations looked like, starting with harassment, fraudulent documents, and attempted property theft. Before heading to the board meeting, I knew I needed to establish my position clearly and firmly. I sat down at my antique desk, another violation, according to Pine Valley's notice, since it was visible from my front window, and drafted my official response to their accusations. Years of technical writing had taught me the value of precise, unambiguous language. I crafted my rebuttal with the same care I'd use for a legal document, addressing each of their ridiculous claims point by point. Regarding your notice dated date, I am writing to formally reject all alleged violations and associated fines. Let me be absolutely clear about several key points. My property at address is not now, has never been, and will never be under Pine Valley Estates HOA jurisdiction. Any attempt to claim authority over this property is legally void. Your violation notice constitutes harassment and an attempted illegal seizure of property rights. The historical status of this home predates your HOA by nearly a century. Any attempt to modify its historic features would violate local preservation guidelines. Your compliance agreement represents an illegal attempt to coerce property transfer through fraudulent fines and threats. All further communication must be directed through my legal counsel. I made copies, one for my records, one for my lawyer, one for the local historical society, and one to present at the meeting. Each copy was notarized, thanks to Mrs. Chen's daughter, who worked as a notary and rushed over on her lunch break. While waiting for the meeting time, I received 3 more unexpected allies. The first was James Harrison, son of my home's previous owner, who'd driven up from Portland after Mrs. Chen called him about the situation. He brought with him a stack of documentation about previous attempts by Pine Valley to encroach on the historic district. Dad fought them off twice in the 90s, he explained, spreading out old letters and legal documents on my dining room table. They tried claiming our driveway was their property back then too. The judge threw it out so fast it made their heads spin. The second ally was Marcus Thompson, a local real estate attorney who specialized in property rights disputes. He'd heard about the situation through my lawyer and offered to attend the meeting as an observer. These HOA expansion attempts are becoming a pattern across the county, he explained. We need to stop it here before it spreads. The third was Sarah Jenkins from the County Historical Preservation Board. She arrived with official documentation of my home's historical status and the protected elements that Pine Valley was trying to declare as violations. They can't touch your house, she assured me, pointing to specific ordinances. It's protected under 3 different historical preservation statutes. Any attempt to force modifications would violate state law. Armed with this support and documentation, I felt ready for the confrontation ahead, but I also knew I needed to maintain my composure. Victoria would be looking for any sign of emotional response she could use against me. I changed into my most professional outfit. Not a power suit, like Victoria's, but a tasteful ensemble that showed I took this seriously while still maintaining my own style. The contrast would be telling, their artificial uniformity versus my authentic individuality. Just before leaving, I took one last walk through my home. Every violation they'd cited was actually a piece of history, a feature that made this house unique. The wraparound porch where generations had gathered, the gingerbread trim that showcased Victorian craftsmanship, the heritage roses that connected my garden to the neighborhood's past. Looking out my front window at the Pine Valley houses across the creek, with their identical facades and regulated paint colors, I understood something important. This wasn't just about property rights or HOA overreach. This was about preserving the character and history of a neighborhood against those who would replace it with cookie-cutter conformity. I gathered my documents, checked my recording device, legal in our state for public meetings, and headed out. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, and several other neighbors were already waiting to caravan to the meeting together. United, just as our historic district had always been. Victoria wanted a fight. She was about to learn that some things, like property, rights, historical preservation, and community character, were worth fighting for. And we were ready to fight smart, fight legal, and most importantly, fight together. The first official escalation from Pine Valley arrived with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer through a stained glass window. 1 week after the violation notices, they launched what I can only describe as a full-scale legal assault disguised as community improvement initiatives. It started with a certified letter, this time from Pine Valley's law firm, Blackwood, Sherman and Associates. The name Blackwood caught my attention immediately. A quick Google search confirmed my suspicion. The firm's senior partner was Victoria's husband. The conflict of interest was so blatant it was almost laughable. The letter was 20 pages long, filled with legal jargon and veiled threats. But stripped of its fancy language, their message was clear. Submit to Pine Valley's authority, or face legal consequences. They cited obscure property laws, questionable precedents, and even tried to argue that the creek separating our properties technically fell under their jurisdiction, thereby giving them control of both banks, including my side. They'd attached a voluntary compliance agreement that was anything but voluntary. According to this document, I would, Dean, voluntarily submit my property to Pine Valley HOA jurisdiction, pay all outstanding violation fines, now mysteriously increased to $35,000 in fee, agree to remediate all non-conforming historical features within 90 days. Grant Pine Valley's Architectural Committee full approval rights over any future modifications. Pay 5 years of HOA dues in advance as a good faith gesture. In return, they would generously allow me to keep my home, though under their strict oversight. The audacity was breathtaking. I immediately scanned everything and sent it to my lawyer. Her response came within minutes. They're desperate. This level of aggressive legal action this early means they're trying to intimidate you before we can build our case. Don't respond directly. Let them dig their hole deeper. But Pine Valley wasn't done. That same afternoon, I received notice that they'd filed permits for infrastructure improvements that would directly impact my property. Their plans included rerouting the main access road to my house through their controlled gates, installing security cameras that would coincidentally cover my entire property, reinforcing the creek bank in a way that would restrict my water access, placing their maintenance shed directly on the property line, blocking my garden view. Each proposal was carefully worded to sound reasonable while effectively creating a noose of control around my property. They were trying to box me in, literally and figuratively. The most concerning part was their timeline. They'd fast-tracked these permits by claiming urgent community safety needs. If I didn't act quickly, they could begin construction before I could legally stop them. I spent that evening making calls. First to the county permit office, where I filed formal objections to each proposal, then to the Historical Society, who confirmed that any modifications to the creek bank would require their approval due to its historical significance. Finally, to a local environmental group that had successfully fought similar water access issues in the past. While I was on the phone, Mrs. Chen came over with more neighbors. Word had spread about Pine Valley's latest moves, and people were worried. Mr. Rodriguez brought copies of permit applications they'd filed affecting his property. Mrs. Patterson had received a similar legal letter. Even residents from within Pine Valley itself was starting to question these aggressive tactics. "They tried this with my mother's property last year," said Linda Evans, a Pine Valley resident I hadn't met before. "She ended up selling because she couldn't afford to fight them. I've regretted not helping her stand up to them ever since." We spread all our documents across my dining room table: permits, letters, violation notices. A pattern emerged. Pine Valley wasn't just targeting my property. They were systematically trying to absorb the entire historic district through a combination of legal pressure, infrastructure control, and financial intimidation. That's when I decided to change strategies. Instead of just defending my property, it was time to go on the offensive. I called my lawyer back with a new plan. We would challenge not just their current actions, but their entire pattern of predatory expansion. "Get me everything you can on similar cases," I told her. "I want to know every time they've tried this, successful or not, and find out if any of their previous victims would be willing to testify." The stakes had just gotten much higher, but so had our resolve. Victoria and her HOA hadn't just picked a fight with one homeowner. They'd declared war on an entire community's right to exist independently, and we were ready to fight back with everything we had. As I filed away the latest legal threats, I glanced out at my garden, where the heritage roses were starting to bloom. Some things were worth protecting, no matter the cost. Pine Valley was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The cavalry arrived in the form of Rachel Sullivan, a property rights attorney who specialized in fighting HOA overreach. She showed up at my door early one morning, briefcase in one hand, coffee carrier in the other, looking more like she was headed to battle than a legal consultation. "I heard you've got a Pine Valley problem," she said, stepping inside. "I've been waiting for someone to take them on properly." She set her things down and pulled out a laptop covered in legal stickers. "Let's talk strategy." Rachel wasn't just any lawyer. She was the same attorney who'd successfully defended several historic districts from similar takeover attempts across the state. More importantly, she dealt with Victoria's husband's law firm before and knew all their tactics. "They always follow the same playbook," Rachel explained, spreading out case files on my dining room table. "First comes the intimidation, violation notices, threats of fines. Then the infrastructure manipulation, trying to control access points. Finally, the legal barrage, hoping to overwhelm homeowners with paperwork and costs until they give up." She pulled up documents from 3 other cases where Pine Valley had attempted similar expansions. "But here's what they don't want you to know. They've never actually won a case on legal merits. They've only succeeded when people couldn't afford to fight back. That's when the real planning began." Rachel had brought reinforcements: a paralegal who specialized in property records, a civil engineer who could challenge their infrastructure claims, and most surprisingly, a former Pine Valley board member who'd resigned in protest over their aggressive expansion tactics. "Meet David Chen," Rachel said, introducing a middle-aged man in wire-rimmed glasses. He was on the board when Victoria first proposed these expansion strategies. The things she said in those closed meetings. David shook his head. "It was never about community standards or property values. It was about control and money. The more properties they could force into the HOA, the bigger their budget and the more power they had. David had brought copies of board meeting minutes, internal memos, and financial records, all properly obtained during his time as a board member. They painted a disturbing picture of systematic targeting and planned harassment of independent homeowners. Look at this. He pointed to a budget projection. They've already allocated funds for community expansion, including legal fees and infrastructure modifications. They're planning to target the entire historic district, one property at a time. Rachel was already taking notes. This is gold. They've essentially documented their own conspiracy to harass homeowners into submission. A judge is going to love this. We spent the next several hours developing a comprehensive defense strategy. But Rachel wasn't just interested in protecting my property. She saw an opportunity to set a legal precedent that would protect others from similar tactics. We need to file a countersuit, she explained. Not just for harassment and legal fees, but for a permanent injunction, preventing them from attempting these takeovers anywhere in the historic district. Make it too expensive and legally risky for them to try this again. The paralegal, Sarah, had already found irregularities in Pine Valley's permit applications. They've been misrepresenting property boundaries on official documents, she said, highlighting several discrepancies. That's not just aggressive tactics, that's potentially criminal fraud. The civil engineer, Mike, reviewed their infrastructure plans. These proposed modifications to the access road and creek bank, they're not just inconvenient, they're dangerous. They're ignoring basic safety requirements and environmental regulations. We can challenge these on technical grounds alone. As our team worked, more neighbors started dropping by. Mrs. Chen brought lunch. Mr. Rodriguez offered his construction expertise to challenge their building permits. Even some current Pine Valley residents, hearing about our legal counteroffensive, came forward with their own stories and evidence. We're building more than a legal defense, Rachel observed, watching the impromptu community gathering in my living room. We're creating a coalition. That's what really scares HOAs like Pine Valley, when people start working together instead of staying isolated. By evening, we had a clear battle plan. Rachel would file our countersuit first thing. Monday morning, Sarah would start formal challenges to all their permit applications. Mike would prepare expert testimony about the safety issues in their infrastructure plans, and David would provide insider testimony about their systematic targeting of independent properties. They're expecting you to fight defensively, Rachel said as we wrapped up, to waste time and money just trying to protect your own property. Instead, we're going to shine a spotlight on their entire operation, make them defend their actions not just against you, but against the whole community. As everyone left, I felt something I hadn't since this whole ordeal began: hope. We weren't just fighting to protect one historic home anymore. We were fighting to protect an entire community's right to maintain its independence and character. Victoria and her HOA had picked this fight, thinking they could isolate and overwhelm individual homeowners. Instead, they'd united us. And with Rachel leading our legal strategy, they were about to learn just how expensive and public their mistake would become. The next phase of our battle involved extensive information gathering and detective work. That would make any investigative journalist proud. Rachel had taught me that winning this kind of fight wasn't just about having the law on our side. It was about understanding exactly what we were up against. Armed with David's insider knowledge and Rachel's legal guidance, we began digging deep into Pine Valley's history. Sarah, Rachel's paralegal, set up a command center in my dining room, surrounded by property records, permit applications, and board meeting minutes going back 2 decades. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said, creating a timeline on my wall with color-coded sticky notes. Every time property values in the area rise, they launch another expansion attempt. They tried in 1995 when the historic district was first designated, again in 2008 during the housing boom, and now they're trying again. But it wasn't just historical records we were gathering. Current Pine Valley residents, emboldened by our resistance, began coming forward with their own stories and documentation. Linda Evans, who'd lost her mother's property to Pine Valley's tactics, brought a treasure trove of correspondence. They told Mom her fines would be waived if she sold to an approved buyer, Linda explained, showing us the letters. Turns out, all their approved buyers were shell companies owned by board members' relatives. They got her house for 20% below market value. The civil engineer, Mike, spent days surveying the creek and access road, documenting every detail of Pine Valley's proposed improvements. His findings were damning. Their plans would actually create drainage problems and increase flood risks, he explained, spreading out technical drawings. They're not just being aggressive, they're being reckless. These modifications could cause serious environmental damage. One particularly interesting discovery came from Mrs. Chen's grandson, a tech-savvy college student who'd been helping us organize digital records. He found discrepancies in Pine Valley's financial reports, significant ones. They're collecting special assessments for infrastructure improvements, he pointed out, highlighting numbers on his laptop screen. But the amounts don't match. They're filed permits. Where's the extra money going? Rachel immediately latched onto this. This could be huge. If they're misappropriating funds or using them for unauthorized purposes, we're not just looking at civil issues anymore. We also focused on documenting the current state of affairs. Every interaction with Pine Valley was recorded, photographed, or documented in writing. When their inspection teams drove by my house multiple times daily, security cameras caught it all. When they sent more violation notices, each one was carefully logged and analyzed. Build the paper trail, Rachel advised. Courts love documentation. The more evidence we have of systematic harassment, the stronger our case becomes. The most revealing information came from unexpected sources. A former Pine Valley maintenance worker contacted us after hearing about our fight. He had photos of board members trespassing on private property to document violations. A postal worker reported being pressured to misdeliver HOA notices to non-member properties. Even a local real estate agent shared emails from Victoria attempting to discourage potential buyers from purchasing homes in the historic district. But our most significant discovery came from deep in the county archives. Sarah found the original Pine Valley development plans from 1990, including specific language that permanently excluded the historic district from their jurisdiction. This is why they're using forged documents, she realized. The original agreements explicitly prevent them from expanding into this area. They're trying to rewrite history. We organized all this information methodically, creating detailed timelines, relationship maps, and evidence portfolios. Each piece of documentation was carefully verified and backed up. Rachel insisted on maintaining strict chain of custody for everything, no amateur hour in this investigation. Remember, she said, reviewing our findings, we're not just building a defense. We're constructing a narrative that shows a pattern of deliberate, systematic attempts to seize private property through harassment and manipulation. The scale of what we uncovered was staggering. Pine Valley's expansion attempts weren't just affecting a few properties. They were part of a larger strategy to absorb entire neighborhoods. They'd been playing a long game, gradually acquiring properties through pressure tactics and strategic harassment. As we compiled our evidence, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about protecting my house anymore. We were uncovering a pattern of behavior that threatened the entire concept of property rights and community independence. Victoria and her board had picked this fight thinking they could overwhelm a single homeowner with legal pressure and bureaucratic harassment. Instead, they'd inspired a full-scale investigation into their entire operation, and what we were finding suggested their aggressive expansion tactics were just the tip of a very troubling iceberg. With our evidence gathered and strategy in place, it was time to launch our first major counteroffensive. Rachel helped me draft a comprehensive response that would serve as both a legal defense and a powerful statement of intent. The document we created wasn't just a reply to their demands, it was a declaration of war, property rights defense, and notice of legal action, the header read. Below it, we systematically dismantled every single claim Pine Valley had made, while simultaneously putting them on notice for their own violations. First came our response to their violation notices. We included photographs of my property alongside historical documentation, proving that every feature they'd cited as a violation was actually a protected historical element. Sarah had even found architectural drawings from 1892 showing that my non-conforming porch was original to the house. Next, we addressed their fraudulent expansion claims. We attached the original development documents we'd found in the county archives, highlighting the specific language that permanently excluded the historic district from their jurisdiction. Alongside this, we included expert analysis of their forged documents, pointing out each discrepancy and inconsistency. The infrastructure section was particularly strong, thanks to Mike's engineering report. We detailed how their proposed modifications would violate multiple safety regulations and environmental protection laws. The drainage studies alone were enough to halt their construction plans. But the real punch came in our countersuit. Rachel had crafted it beautifully, turning each of their tactics back against them. The defendants, through their systematic pattern of harassment, attempted property seizure and fraudulent documentation, have engaged in a conspiracy to deprive property owners of their legal rights through coercion and intimidation. This behavior constitutes attempted property theft through fraudulent means, ongoing harassment and intimidation, filing of false documents with government agencies, misappropriation of HOA funds for unauthorized purposes, multiple violations of state property laws and historical preservation statutes. We demanded not just an end to their expansion attempts, but significant damages, full reimbursement of legal fees and costs, compensation for harassment and attempted property theft, punitive damages to discourage similar behavior in the future, a permanent injunction against any further expansion attempts, public retraction of all false claims and violation notices. The document was over 50 pages long, with another 100 pages of supporting evidence. Every claim was meticulously documented. Every accusation was supported by multiple sources. It was, as Rachel put it, a legal thunderbolt. We filed it first thing Monday morning, making sure to send copies to every relevant agency: the County Recorder's Office, the Historical Preservation Board, the Environmental Protection Department, and the State Attorney General's Office. Now watch how they react, Rachel advised. Their response will tell us a lot about their next move. We didn't have to wait long. By that afternoon, Victoria's husband's law firm had requested an emergency meeting. They tried to frame it as a good faith attempt at resolution, but we knew better. They were scrambling. Deny the meeting request, Rachel advised. Make them respond in writing. Every document they generate is more evidence for us. Instead of meeting, we sent a follow-up letter outlining our terms for any future negotiations. Immediate cessation of all harassment and expansion attempts. Written acknowledgement that my property was outside their jurisdiction. Withdrawal of all violation notices and fines for public retraction of their false claims. Payment of all legal fees incurred to date. They won't accept these terms, Rachel predicted. But that's not the point. We're establishing our position and forcing them to either back down publicly or double down on their illegal behavior. The local media had gotten wind of the story by this point. Several reporters contacted me for comments, but Rachel advised, staying quiet for now. "Let our legal filings speak for themselves," she said. "They tell a pretty compelling story." She was right. Within days, 3 different news outlets had published stories about the dispute, using public records to piece together Pine Valley's pattern of aggressive expansion attempts. The coverage wasn't flattering. Victoria's response came through her lawyers, a blustering letter threatening additional legal action if we didn't withdraw our defamatory claims. Rachel actually smiled when she read it. "They're panicking," she said. "Notice how they're not actually addressing any of our specific allegations. They can't, because everything we've claimed is documented fact. We'd fired our first major shot in this battle, and it had hit its mark. Now we just had to prepare for their counterattack, which, knowing Victoria, would be both swift and aggressive. But this time, we were ready for whatever they might throw at us. Victoria's counterattack came like a hurricane, fierce and multi-directional. She wasn't just fighting back. She was trying to bury us in legal and bureaucratic quicksand. Within days of our filing, Pine Valley launched what Rachel called their nuclear option. First came the legal barrage. Their law firm filed 5 separate motions in court, each hundreds of pages long. They challenged everything from my property's historical status to the legitimacy of my original purchase. They even tried to argue that my home's age made it a public safety hazard, requiring HOA oversight. But they didn't stop at legal maneuvers. Suddenly, city inspectors were showing up at my door, citing anonymous complaints about everything from potential fire hazards to suspected building code violations. Each inspection required immediate attention, pulling me away from work and draining my resources. "This is classic HOA warfare," Rachel explained as we dealt with yet another surprise inspection. "They're trying to overwhelm you with bureaucratic obstacles while their legal team builds their case. But notice what they're not doing, actually addressing our evidence of their fraud." The pressure campaign extended beyond just inspections. Pine Valley residents who had supported us started receiving their own violation notices. Linda Evans found her parking privileges revoked. Mr. Rodriguez's adult son was banned from using the community pool. They were trying to isolate us by making examples of our allies. Then came their masterstroke, or what they thought was one. Victoria's husband's law firm filed an emergency motion claiming my restoration work was damaging a historical landmark and demanded an immediate stop work order. They cited their own architectural experts who claimed my renovations were irreparably harming the historical integrity of the house. The irony was almost comical. The same HOA that had demanded I remove my home's historical features was now trying to pose as a defender of historical preservation. But the legal maneuver was clever. If granted, the stop work order would leave my home partially renovated and potentially unsafe. "They're getting desperate," Rachel observed, reviewing their latest filing. "Look at these expert credentials. Their primary architectural consultant specializes in modern commercial buildings. He's never worked on a historic restoration in his life, but their most aggressive move targeted my property access directly. Late one evening, I returned home to find heavy construction equipment parked along the access road. Posted notices announced emergency infrastructure repairs starting the next morning. Repairs that would effectively cut off vehicle access to my property for approximately 2 to 3 weeks. I immediately called Rachel. "They can't do this," I said, sending her photos of the equipment and notices. "They're trying to trap me in my own home." "Actually, this is exactly what we needed," Rachel replied, sounding oddly pleased. "They just crossed a line from aggressive tactics into clear legal violation. Get Mike out there first thing tomorrow with his camera. We need to document everything." Mike arrived at dawn, before the construction crew. His professional assessment was damning. There were no infrastructure issues requiring emergency repairs. The whole thing was a fabricated excuse to disrupt access to my property. We filed for an emergency injunction, and this time the judge acted quickly. By noon, we had a court order halting any construction work on the access road. But more importantly, we had proof of Pine Valley's willingness to manufacture false emergencies to achieve their goals. "This is going into the amended complaint," Rachel said, already drafting new legal documents. "They've just demonstrated a pattern of using fraudulent safety claims to harass homeowners. That's going to play very badly in court." Victoria's response to the injunction was telling. Instead of backing down, she called an emergency HOA board meeting. Through our allies in Pine Valley, we learned they were discussing a special assessment to raise additional legal funds. They were preparing for a long, expensive battle, but their aggressive response had an unintended effect. More Pine Valley residents, alarmed by the escalating legal costs and heavy-handed tactics, began reaching out to us. We received copies of internal emails, board meeting recordings, and financial documents, all showing a pattern of using HOA funds to wage personal vendettas against non-compliant homeowners. "Keep documenting everything," Rachel advised. "Every inspection, every notice, every attempt to interfere with your property rights. They think they can wear you down with constant harassment. Instead, they're building our case for us." As I watched another city inspector leave my property that evening, I realized Victoria's nuclear option had backfired. Instead of intimidating us into submission, their aggressive escalation had only strengthened our resolve and provided more evidence of their illegal tactics. The battle was far from over, but their desperation was showing. And in legal warfare, desperation often leads to mistakes we were more than ready to capitalize on. During our investigation of Pine Valley's tactics, we uncovered something far more disturbing than simple HOA overreach. Hidden in the stacks of financial records and board meeting minutes was evidence of what appeared to be a systematic property acquisition scheme that went far beyond mere expansion plans. Sarah, poring over years of financial documents, found the first red flag. "Look at these property purchases," she said, highlighting a series of transactions. "Every time they forced someone out through their harassment campaign, the property was bought by one of 3 different LLCs, and guess who owns those LLCs?" The paper trail led straight to a network of companies owned by Victoria, her husband, and several board members. They weren't just trying to expand the HOA's territory, they were personally profiting from forcing homeowners out. "This explains the aggressive tactics," Rachel said, reviewing the evidence. "They're not just power-hungry, they're running a real estate scheme. Force people out through harassment, buy the properties at distressed prices, then flip them for profit once they're under HOA control." The numbers were staggering. Over the past 5 years, they'd acquired 6 properties this way, each purchased for well below market value and resold at a significant profit. The total earnings from these transactions exceeded $500,000, none of which had been disclosed to HOA members. But the real bombshell came from David, the former board member. He found old emails discussing their acquisition strategy in explicit detail. They had actually created a ranking system for targeting properties based on factors like property value potential after improvements, owners, estimated financial resources to fight back, proximity to existing Pine Valley boundaries, historical architectural significance that could be leveraged for control. My property, it turned out, had been at the top of their target list. The Victorian architecture, prime location, and potential value after modernization made it their ideal acquisition. They'd even prepared marketing materials for the eventual resale, showing my historic home stripped of its character and converted into a modern luxury residence. "This isn't just unethical, it's potentially criminal," Rachel said, organizing the evidence. "They're using their HOA authority to engage in what amounts to real estate fraud." We brought in a forensic accountant to trace the money flows. His analysis revealed a complex web of transactions designed to hide the true nature of their operation. HOA funds were being used to pay for the legal harassment, while the profits from property flips were being channeled through multiple shell companies. Linda Evans' mother's property provided a perfect example of their tactics. The approved buyer, who purchased her home for 20% below market value, was actually a shell company controlled by Victoria's brother-in-law. 6 months later, after minimal renovations, the property was resold at a 40% profit. They've been doing this long enough to perfect their system, the accountant explained. Target a property, harass the owner with violations and fines, create access issues, then swoop in with a friendly offer to help them out of their trouble. It's predatory real estate acquisition 101. The discovery explained why Victoria had reacted so aggressively to our resistance. We weren't just fighting their HOA expansion, we were threatening to expose their entire operation. Mrs. Chen provided another crucial piece of evidence. She'd kept records of every property sale in the neighborhood for the past decade, including notes about the circumstances of each sale. A clear pattern emerged. Every forced sale followed the same sequence of escalating harassment, infrastructure interference, and finally, a below-market purchase by one of their shell companies. This is why they're so desperate to stop us, Rachel realized. If we expose this scheme, it's not just about HOA overreach anymore. There could be serious legal consequences. We spent days organizing the evidence into a clear narrative. The documentation was overwhelming. Financial records showing the hidden property transactions, emails discussing their targeting strategy, board meeting minutes revealing their use of HOA funds for harassment, property records demonstrating the pattern of undervalued purchases, documentation of the shell companies and their connections to board members. We need to be careful how we use this, Rachel advised. This is bigger than our original case. We may need to involve regulatory authorities. The magnitude of what we'd uncovered was sobering. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. We'd stumbled onto a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme hiding behind the facade of HOA authority. As we prepared to update our legal filings with this new information, I couldn't help but think about all the homeowners who'd already fallen victim to their scheme. Victoria and her associates hadn't just been building an HOA empire, they'd been systematically profiting from the destruction of a historic neighborhood's character and the displacement of its residents. The question now was how to best use this information to not only stop their current attempts, but also bring justice to those they'd already harmed. With our explosive discoveries about Pine Valley's real estate scheme, we knew we had to act strategically. Rachel advised against immediately going public with everything we'd found. Instead, we developed a careful, multi-pronged approach to maximize the impact of our evidence. First, we filed an amended complaint with the court, expanding our case to include the newly discovered pattern of fraudulent property acquisitions. The filing was meticulous, with over 200 pages of supporting documentation. But we deliberately held back some of our most damning evidence, keeping our powder dry for what we suspected would be inevitable denials from Victoria and her associates. Let them dig their hole deeper, Rachel advised. Every denial they make on record will just make our follow-up evidence more powerful. Simultaneously, we began reaching out to regulatory authorities. I spent an entire day meeting with investigators from the State Real Estate Commission, walking them through the pattern we'd uncovered. Their reaction was telling. What had started as a routine complaint meeting turned into a 3-hour evidence review session. We've been getting scattered complaints about Pine Valley for years, one investigator admitted. But nobody's ever connected the dots like this before. We also took proactive steps to protect our evidence. Everything was digitized and stored in multiple secure locations. Rachel had seen too many cases where crucial documents mysteriously disappeared once investigations began. We weren't taking any chances. The next phase of our strategy involved building public pressure. We carefully leaked certain non-sensitive documents to local journalists who had been covering the dispute. The story began to shift from a simple HOA conflict to something much bigger. Historic neighborhood under siege. Investigation reveals. Pattern of predatory property practices, read one headline. Another local paper ran a detailed piece tracking the pattern of forced sales and below-market purchases. The media attention had an unexpected benefit. More victims of Pine Valley's scheme started coming forward. A retired couple who'd lost their craftsman bungalow 2 years ago provided emails showing the same pattern of harassment and forced sale. A widower shared documentation of how they'd used emergency assessments to drain his savings until he had to sell. Each new story strengthened our case and added to the growing public outrage. But Victoria wasn't going down without a fight. Pine Valley's law firm launched an aggressive media campaign of their own, portraying themselves as defenders of property values and community standards. They're trying to control the narrative, Rachel observed. Notice how they keep talking about property values and community improvement, but never address the specific allegations about their acquisition practices. We countered by releasing more evidence, carefully timed for maximum impact. When they claimed their property purchases were all arm's-length transactions, we revealed documentation showing the shell company connections. When they insisted all sales were at fair market value, we produced appraisals showing systematic undervaluation. The pressure began to show results. Several Pine Valley board members, seeing where this was heading, quietly resigned. Homeowners within Pine Valley started organizing special meetings to discuss the revelations. Victoria's carefully constructed power structure was beginning to crack, but our most effective move came through the historical preservation angle. Working with Sarah Jenkins from the Preservation Board, we documented how Pine Valley's acquisition scheme had specifically targeted historically significant properties. This caught the attention of state historical preservation authorities who launched their own investigation. This is no longer just about property rights, Sarah explained during a Preservation Board hearing. This is about the systematic destruction of our community's architectural heritage for private profit. The preservation angle resonated with the public in a way that complex financial fraud allegations couldn't. People could see the physical evidence of what was being lost. Beautiful historic homes either destroyed or stripped of their character after forced sales. We also began working with other neighborhoods facing similar pressures. Our investigation had revealed that Pine Valley's tactics weren't unique. Other HOAs were watching their methods closely, hoping to employ similar strategies for expansion. We need to make this case big enough to discourage copycats, Rachel advised. It's not enough to just stop Pine Valley. We need to make an example that will make other HOAs think twice about trying the same tactics. As our counter-offensive gained momentum, we could see the impact in Victoria's increasingly desperate responses. Their legal filings became more aggressive, but less focused. Their public statements shifted from confident dismissals to angry denunciations. We were no longer just defending against their attacks. We were systematically dismantling their entire operation. Each piece of evidence we released, each new investigation we sparked, added another crack to their facade. The question wasn't if their scheme would collapse, but when, and how many more of their victims we could help in the process. The major confrontation came in the form of a pivotal court hearing that would determine the course of our entire case. Victoria and her team had filed for an emergency injunction of their own, attempting to halt our investigations and seal the evidence we'd gathered, claiming it was privileged HOA information. The courthouse that morning was packed. Word had spread about the hearing, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, and dozens of other residents filled the benches. Even some current Pine Valley residents were there, quietly showing support for our side. Victoria arrived with an entourage, her husband leading a team of 4 lawyers, all carrying identical leather briefcases and wearing nearly identical suits. They looked more like corporate raiders than property lawyers, which, given what we'd uncovered, was probably appropriate. "Ready for this?" Rachel asked, as we took our seats. She'd spent the previous night preparing for every possible argument they might make. "Remember, they're going to try to make this about HOA rights and property values. Don't let them change the narrative." The hearing began with Victoria's team presenting their case. Their lead attorney painted a picture of a responsible HOA simply trying to maintain community standards, portraying our investigation as a malicious attempt to undermine their authority. "What we're seeing here is a coordinated attack on the very concept of homeowners associations," he argued. "The plaintiffs are attempting to use privileged internal documents to create a false narrative of wrongdoing." Then came their masterstroke, or what they thought was one. They presented affidavits from several homeowners who'd sold to Pine Valley, all claiming they'd done so willingly and at fair prices. The signatures looked perfect, the statements professionally prepared. Rachel simply smiled. We'd been expecting this. When our turn came, she approached the podium with a single manila envelope. "Your Honor, before we address the broader issues, I'd like to discuss these affidavits." She opened the envelope and handed documents to the clerk. "What you're about to see is evidence that every one of these affidavits was obtained under duress or through misrepresentation." Over the next 30 minutes, Rachel methodically dismantled each affidavit. One willing seller was in the hospital when they supposedly signed. Another had been promised their signature would stop the HOA fines against their daughter's property. A third hadn't even been in the country on the date listed. "And this, Your Honor," Rachel continued, "is just one example of the systematic deception we've uncovered." She proceeded to lay out our evidence of their property acquisition scheme, including financial records, emails, and board meeting minutes. Victoria's team tried to object, claiming the documents were obtained illegally, but Rachel was ready. "Every piece of evidence we're presenting was either provided by concerned board members or obtained through legal public records requests. If the defendants are uncomfortable with this information being public, perhaps they should have considered that before using HOA funds for private real estate speculation." The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, listened carefully to both sides. When Victoria's husband attempted to interrupt Rachel's presentation, the judge shut him down with a single look. "What I'm seeing here," the judge finally said, "goes well beyond normal HOA operations. These documents suggest a pattern of behavior that requires further investigation." She denied Pine Valley's motion to seal the evidence and instead ordered them to preserve all records related to their property acquisitions. But the real bombshell came when the judge referred our evidence to the district attorney's office for review. "The allegations of fraudulent property acquisition and misuse of HOA funds rise to a level that warrants criminal investigation," she stated. Victoria's face went pale. This was clearly not how she'd expected the hearing to go. Her husband started frantically whispering to their other lawyers. As we left the courthouse, reporters were waiting outside. Rachel handled their questions professionally, sticking to the facts we could prove while hinting at more revelations to come. "Today's ruling is just the beginning," she told them. "Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond simple HOA overreach. We intend to ensure that all responsible parties are held accountable." Back at my house that evening, celebrating with our core team, we knew we'd reached a turning point. Victoria's attempt to silence us had instead given us a bigger platform and stronger legal standing. "They'll try something else," Rachel warned. "People like this don't give up easily, but now they know we can hurt them, and that changes everything." She was right. We'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Victoria and her associates had too much to lose to give up now, but for the first time, they were the ones on the defensive, and we were the ones with momentum. Looking around at our team, Rachel, Sarah, Mrs. Chen, and all the others who'd helped us get this far, I knew we were ready for whatever came next. We'd taken their best shot, and not only survived, but turned it against them. The next move was theirs, but thanks to this hearing, they'd be making it from a much weaker position. After the hearing, our legal strategy shifted into high gear. Rachel brought in additional specialists to strengthen our case: a real estate fraud expert, a forensic accountant specializing in HOA finances, and most importantly, a former state prosecutor who had experience with property rights cases. "We're not just fighting a civil case anymore," Rachel explained during our strategy session. "With the judge's referral to the DA's office, we need to be prepared for this to become a criminal investigation. That changes everything about how we proceed." The former prosecutor, Janet Martinez, reviewed our evidence with fresh eyes. "What you've uncovered here isn't just HOA overreach," she said, spreading documents across my dining room table. "This is a sophisticated racketeering operation using an HOA as cover. The way they've structured their property acquisitions, the use of shell companies, the systematic harassment campaigns, it all fits the pattern of organized real estate fraud." Our team spent days organizing the evidence into clear timelines and relationship maps. Each forced sale was documented in detail, showing the pattern of harassment, the below-market purchase price, and the connection to Victoria's network of shell companies. "Look at how they time their violations," Janet pointed out, highlighting a series of notices. "They wait until homeowners are most vulnerable, right after major life events like medical emergencies or job losses. Then they hit them with massive fines and architectural demands. It's predatory behavior, pure and simple." The forensic accountant dug deeper into Pine Valley's finances, uncovering layers of financial manipulation. "They've been using HOA funds to finance their private property acquisitions," he explained. "Special assessments that were supposed to be for infrastructure improvements were actually funding their legal harassment campaigns. That's not just unethical, it's criminal misappropriation." Rachel coordinated with the DA's office, sharing our findings while carefully maintaining our position in the civil case. "We need to walk a fine line," she advised. "We want to support the criminal investigation without compromising our ability to seek civil damages." Meanwhile, Victoria and her team were scrambling. Our sources within Pine Valley reported emergency board meetings, late-night document shredding sessions, and a sudden interest in updating their financial records. "They're in panic mode," David, our former board member insider, reported. "Victoria's trying to distance herself from the property acquisitions, claiming she was just acting on board recommendations. But we have emails proving she orchestrated the whole thing. The pressure was getting to them. Their usually meticulous legal filings became sloppy, filled with contradictions and easily disprovable claims. When they tried to argue that all their property purchases were arm's-length transactions, we produced documentation showing how their shell companies were interconnected. "They're making rookie mistakes," Janet observed. "People like this are used to operating in the shadows. Once their actions are exposed to scrutiny, they start to unravel." Our team grew as more professionals joined the fight. A title company investigator who'd noticed irregularities in Pine Valley's property transfers provided detailed records of their transactions. A former city planning official shared emails showing how they'd manipulated zoning regulations to pressure homeowners. But our most powerful allies were the victims of their previous schemes. Once word got out about our case, people began coming forward with their stories. Each account followed the same pattern: targeted harassment, escalating fines, infrastructure, interference, and finally a forced sale to one of Victoria's shell companies. "We need to document everything," Rachel insisted. "Every story, every piece of evidence, every connection. We're not just building a case, we're exposing a systematic abuse of HOA authority that's been going on for years." The professional support proved crucial when Victoria's team launched their next attack, a massive defamation lawsuit naming me, Rachel, and several of our key witnesses as defendants. "This is desperate," Rachel said, reviewing their filing. "They're trying to intimidate our witnesses and drain our resources, but they've made a crucial mistake. They've opened themselves up to discovery on all their communications." She was right. The defamation suit gave us legal authority to demand access to years of internal communications, financial records, and board meeting minutes that we might not have otherwise been able to obtain. "They've handed us a gift," Janet agreed. "Now we can legally compel them to produce documents they've been trying to hide, and if they destroy anything now, they're committing criminal evidence tampering." As our professional team grew stronger, Victoria's support began to crumble. Board members, seeing the writing on the wall, started resigning. HOA members, learning how their dues had been misused, called for emergency elections. We were no longer just fighting a legal battle, we were dismantling an entire system of corruption. And with each new expert who joined our team, our ability to expose and document their schemes grew stronger. The tide had turned. Now it was just a matter of following the evidence wherever it led, no matter how high up the corruption went. The community impact of our legal battle spread far beyond Pine Valley's borders. As news of our case circulated, we began receiving calls and emails from homeowners across the state facing similar HOA takeover attempts. Rachel organized a town hall meeting at the local library to accommodate everyone who wanted to share their stories. The turnout was overwhelming. Over 200 people packed the meeting room, many driving hours to attend. "This isn't just happening here," a woman from another county explained, sharing documentation of her HOA's expansion attempts. "They're using the same playbook: false violations, access control, forced sales. It's like they're all working from the same manual." The evidence suggested she was right. We discovered online forums where HOA boards shared tactics for forcing property acquisitions. Victoria had been an active participant, offering advice on using infrastructure control and selective enforcement to pressure homeowners. Local officials began taking notice. The City Council scheduled hearings on HOA oversight. The County Recorder's Office launched an audit of recent property transfers. Even state legislators started asking questions about the need for stronger HOA regulations. Mrs. Chen organized a neighborhood preservation committee, documenting the historical significance of each property Pine Valley had targeted. Their research revealed a pattern of targeting architecturally unique homes, then stripping them of their historic features after acquisition. "They're not just taking our properties," she testified at a preservation board hearing. "They're erasing our neighborhood's history." The media coverage expanded from local news to regional outlets. Investigative reporters began digging into similar cases across the state, uncovering a network of connected HOAs using identical tactics. Most significantly, current Pine Valley residents started organizing against their board. Led by Linda Evans, they formed a homeowners' rights group demanding transparency and accountability. "We never authorized our dues to be used for property speculation," Linda declared at an emergency HOA meeting. "We want a full audit and new elections." The support wasn't just moral. People contributed financially to our legal fund, shared crucial documents, and volunteered their expertise. A retired building inspector provided evidence of selective code enforcement. A former city planner exposed how Pine Valley had manipulated zoning regulations. Victoria's support base crumbled as more residents learned how their HOA dues had been misused. Board meetings, once rubber stamp affairs, became heated confrontations as homeowners demanded answers. The pressure led to more defections from Victoria's camp. A former board treasurer provided detailed records of questionable financial transactions. Their marketing consultant shared emails discussing plans to renovate historic properties for maximum profit. Even Pine Valley's maintenance staff began speaking out, describing how they'd been ordered to target specific properties for violations while ignoring similar issues in board members' homes. The community impact reached its peak when the State Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into predatory HOA practices, citing our case as a catalyst. This wasn't just about saving my property anymore. We'd sparked a movement for HOA reform and community preservation. Victoria had unknowingly united the very neighborhoods she'd tried to divide and conquer. The groundswell of support made it impossible for Pine Valley's board to operate in shadows anymore. Every move they made was scrutinized, documented, and challenged by an increasingly organized community. We'd created something powerful, a network of informed, engaged homeowners ready to fight back against HOA overreach. The battle for my property had evolved into a fight for community rights and preservation. As Rachel put it, sometimes it takes one person standing up to reveal how many others were waiting for the same opportunity. We'd given people that opportunity, and they'd turned it into a movement. The climactic showdown took place in a packed courthouse during the final hearing. Our case had grown from a simple property dispute into a full-blown fraud investigation, with the district attorney's office joining our side. Victoria and her entire board sat at the defense table, surrounded by their legal team. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by the nervous energy of people watching their scheme unravel. Rachel presented our case methodically, building an irrefutable narrative of corruption and fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions in misappropriated HOA funds, documentation of their property acquisition scheme through shell companies, testimony from former board members about their targeting strategies, expert analysis proving systematic undervaluation of forced sales, evidence of forged documents and falsified violations. The breakthrough came when Victoria's former assistant testified. She detailed how they'd selected targets, manufactured violations, and coordinated their harassment campaigns. Her testimony was devastating, particularly when she produced emails Victoria had ordered deleted. These weren't random acts of HOA overreach, Rachel argued. This was a calculated criminal enterprise using HOA authority as cover for property theft. Victoria's defense crumbled under cross-examination. Her attempts to explain away the shell companies and hidden profits only highlighted the scheme's complexity. When questioned about specific transactions, she repeatedly contradicted her previous sworn statements. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and severe. All HOA claims against my property were permanently dismissed. Pine Valley was ordered to pay substantial damages to affected homeowners. A permanent injunction barred them from attempting any future expansion. Their entire board was removed, with a court-appointed administrator taking control. All their property acquisitions were referred for criminal investigation. But the most satisfying moment came when the judge addressed Victoria directly. In my years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a flagrant abuse of authority for personal gain. You didn't just violate HOA regulations, you betrayed your community's trust and attempted to destroy a historic neighborhood for profit. The damages awarded were substantial, $2.1 million to be paid to affected homeowners, plus another $500,000 in punitive damages. The judge also ordered Pine Valley to cover all legal fees and costs. Victoria sat motionless as the verdict was read, her perfect composure finally shattered. Her husband stormed out of the courtroom, already on his phone to their appeals lawyer. Fee! Courthouse steps were packed with reporters and community members. Rachel handled the press conference masterfully, emphasizing that this verdict wasn't just about one property. It was about protecting communities from predatory HOA practices. Today's ruling sends a clear message, she declared. HOA authority comes with responsibility. It cannot be used as a weapon for personal enrichment or property theft. The criminal investigations were just beginning, but our civil victory had laid the groundwork. Victoria and her associates would spend years dealing with the consequences of their actions. Most importantly, we'd created a legal precedent. Other HOAs would think twice before attempting similar expansion schemes. The judge's ruling became a blueprint for homeowners fighting similar battles across the state. As Mrs. Chen said afterward, "Sometimes you have to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who might face the same battle." We'd done exactly that and won. The historic district was safe, preserved for future generations. And somewhere, I like to think, Mr. Harrison was smiling, knowing his beloved Victorian home had helped expose and stop a scheme that threatened an entire community's heritage. The aftermath of our legal victory brought sweeping changes to Pine Valley and the surrounding community. The court-appointed administrator wasted no time implementing reforms. The entire HOA board was dissolved and new elections scheduled. All questionable property transactions were reversed. A complete audit of HOA finances was ordered. New bylaws were drafted with strict oversight provisions. The aggressive expansion plans were permanently shelved. The most immediate change was in Pine Valley's atmosphere. The constant tension and fear of selective enforcement disappeared. Residents began personalizing their properties again, adding garden features and architectural details that had previously been forbidden. Linda Evans led the transition team, working to rebuild trust between Pine Valley and the surrounding neighborhoods. The first step was dismantling Victoria's infrastructure control schemes. The access road barriers came down and the creekside walking paths were restored to public use. Criminal investigations continued, focusing on Victoria and her inner circle. The forensic accountants uncovered even more financial impropriety than we'd initially found. State prosecutors filed multiple charges: real estate fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds, filing false documents, criminal conspiracy, wire fraud. Victoria and her husband sold their Pine Valley home quietly one night and moved out of state. But they couldn't escape the consequences. Federal authorities were now involved, tracking the money trail through their network of shell companies. The Historical Preservation Board took an active role in restoration efforts. Properties that had been stripped of their character under Pine Valley's regime were carefully restored. The historic district was officially designated as a protected zone, preventing future attempts at hostile takeovers. Mrs. Chen's Preservation Committee became a permanent organization, documenting and protecting the neighborhood's architectural heritage. They created detailed records of each historic property, ensuring their unique features would be preserved for future generations. Most significantly, our case sparked legislative change. State lawmakers used the evidence from our trial to draft new HOA regulations, stricter oversight of HOA finances, limits on expansion authority, protection for historic properties, requirements for transparent governance, prohibition of predatory acquisition tactics. The reforms went beyond just legal changes. A culture shift occurred in how people viewed HOA authority. Other associations across the state began revising their practices, afraid of facing similar scrutiny. The community healing process was perhaps the most remarkable transformation. Former adversaries became allies in rebuilding. Even some of Victoria's strongest supporters admitted they'd been deceived about her true motives. Pine Valley's new board, elected by residents committed to reform, focused on genuine community improvement rather than control and expansion. They reached out to neighboring areas, working to repair relationships damaged by years of aggressive tactics. My Victorian home, the catalyst for this entire battle, stood as a symbol of successful resistance to HOA overreach. The restoration work continued, but now without constant interference and threats. Other historic homeowners felt confident in pursuing their own preservation projects. The legal precedent we'd established became a powerful tool for homeowners across the state. Rachel's office received regular calls from people fighting similar battles, and our case provided a blueprint for their defense. The system changes we'd fought for were taking root, ensuring that no other homeowner would face the same orchestrated campaign of harassment and attempted theft that we'd exposed and defeated. Today, 2 years after our victory, I sit on my fully restored Victorian porch, sipping coffee and admiring the heritage roses in full bloom. The morning peace is no longer interrupted by clipboard-wielding HOA officials or manufactured emergencies. Instead, I hear birds chirping and children playing in the revitalized neighborhood. The final chapter of our story brought lasting change. Pine Valley transformed into a model of responsible HOA governance. Their new board focuses on genuine community enhancement rather than control and expansion. Property values have actually increased now that the toxic atmosphere has cleared. Victoria and her husband eventually faced justice. The federal investigation concluded last month, resulting in multiple convictions for fraud and racketeering. They're facing significant prison time and massive financial penalties. Their illegal profits were seized and will be used to establish a fund for historic home preservation in our area. Our case became required reading in property law courses at the state university. Rachel regularly gives guest lectures about how we exposed and stopped the scheme. The legislative reforms we sparked have been adopted by 3 neighboring states, with more considering similar measures. The historic district is thriving. Mrs. Chen's Preservation Committee now leads walking tours, showcasing the architectural heritage we fought to protect. My home, once targeted for destruction, serves as a testament to successful resistance against corporate greed and HOA overreach. The creek that Victoria tried to use as a weapon now brings our communities together. Residents from both sides enjoy the walking paths and gardens we've created along its banks. The arbitrary boundaries she tried to enforce have dissolved into natural neighborhood connections. Most importantly, we established a precedent that empowers other homeowners to fight back against similar schemes. Our documentation and legal strategy provide a roadmap for protecting property rights and preserving community character. Looking back, what started as a fight for one historic home became something much larger, a movement for accountability, preservation, and community rights. We didn't just save my property, we helped reshape how HOAs operate across the state. Mr. Harrison visited last week. Standing in the front parlor he'd loved for 40 years, tears welled in his eyes, seeing how we'd preserved every historic detail he'd protected for so long. "You didn't just save a house," he said. "You saved a piece of our community's soul." The roses Mrs. Chen gave me that first spring have spread into a magnificent garden, symbolic of how our community has grown stronger through adversity. Like those heritage blooms, our neighborhood's character and independence have deep roots, roots that no amount of corporate greed or HOA overreach could destroy. As I watch the sunrise paint my restored gingerbread trim in golden light, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for. Property rights, community character, historical preservation. These aren't just legal concepts. They're the foundation of genuine neighborhoods where people can put down roots and thrive together. The property seizure sign that once threatened. My driveway has been replaced by a historical marker, telling our story to future generations. It stands as a reminder that when communities unite against injustice, even the most powerful opponents can be defeated. Victory tastes as sweet as my morning coffee, made even better by the knowledge that we didn't just win a battle, we helped change the system itself, and that's worth more than any property value Victoria could have imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.